Years ago, in what is now Central Africa, the planet was a very different place. There were no cities, no tools, no fire, no words, just wind, rain, and the quiet rhythm of life evolving across endless plains. The land we now call Chad was once a much greener place. Back then, it was a mosaic, a living patchwork of forest and savanna, dotted with lakes, shrubs, and scattered trees. Herds of grazing animals moved through the grasses in slow patterns, pausing to drink at muddy watering holes. Forests loomed in the distance, offering shade and fruit to the smaller animals who lived in the canopy. In the middle of all this, neither fully ape nor fully human, walked one of our oldest known ancestors. We call it Sahelanthropus chadensis. It's not a name that rolls easily off the tongue, but its place in our story is unforgettable. It lived about 7 million years ago, and though we don't know what it called itself or how it saw the world, we know this. Sahelanthropus may have been the very first hominin, the earliest branch that split away from the last ancestor we shared with chimpanzees. It was small, likely no more than a meter tall. Its brain was no larger than that of a chimp, maybe even smaller. But the clues left behind in a fossilized skull, found buried in ancient sediment in the desert of northern Chad, tell a story that would change how we understand ourselves. The skull was discovered in 2001 by a French-led research team. It was weathered, incomplete, and partially crushed by time, but it was enough. Enough to show us something critical. The hole where the spinal cord connects, called the foramen magnum, was located underneath the skull, not at the back. That might not sound like much, but it's one of the most important signs of all. It means Sahelanthropus likely walked upright. This matters more than it might seem. Walking on two legs, bipedalism, is one of the most fundamental traits that separates hominins from all other apes. It's not just about walking, it's about freeing the hands, about endurance and traveling long distances. It's the first major step toward becoming human. Before Sahelanthropus, all our ancestors were tree dwellers. They moved on all fours, climbing and swinging through thick forest canopies. But around this time, the climate in Africa began to shift. Rainfall patterns changed. Forests started to thin out, replaced by open grasslands. Trees became more scattered. The world was no longer just vertical. It was spreading outward. For those who could adapt to the open, standing tall had its advantages. Imagine it. A small, upright primate, stepping carefully from the shade of a tree, scanning the horizon. Its eyes higher than before. Its hands free to carry fruit, to hold onto offspring, or perhaps to dig at the soil for roots. It wasn't a hunter. It probably wasn't even a strong forager. But it could move, efficiently and carefully, across both open plains and forest edges. We don't know if Sahelanthropus lived in large groups or small ones, but it likely nested in trees at night for safety and descended during the day to search for food. Its teeth suggest it ate a variety of things: fruits, nuts, leaves, maybe even small insects. It was not yet a toolmaker, not yet a thinker in the way we understand thought today, but it had begun something no other species had done. It had started to walk toward the future. When paleontologists uncovered the skull, they nicknamed it Toolmaking, meaning hope of life in the local Daza language. It's a fitting name because this small, battered fossil marked the earliest evidence of our long evolutionary road. Found far west of the traditional fossil sites in East Africa, it also reshaped our map of early human origins. For a long time, scientists thought the earliest hominins evolved only in the Rift Valley. But Toolmaking reminded us that our beginnings may have been broader, more complex, and more widespread than we imagined. Still, there's much we don't know. We have no full skeleton, no clear sign of what its hands or feet looked like. Did it walk on the ground most of the time, or still spend hours climbing trees? Was upright walking its main mode of travel, or just one part of a mixed lifestyle? These are questions science continues to ask. But even without every answer, the direction was clear. Toomai, Sahelanthropus chidensis, was moving differently. And movement is evolution. As it stood in the heat of the Miocene sun, perhaps shaded by a tree's low branches, it could never have guessed what would follow. That over millions of years, its distant descendants would learn to shape tools, build fire, speak, paint, write, and wonder. But it had taken the first step, literally. Upright walking allowed hominins to use less energy over long distances. It allowed them to see above the tall grass, to use their hands while moving, and over time, it would allow them to carry food, tools, and ideas. But the journey from Sahelanthropus to us was not a straight line. Evolution doesn't work that way. It branches and twists, adapts and retracts. Many species come and go. Some survive for millions of years. Others disappear almost as soon as they arrive. Sahelanthropus was one of many, part of a growing, changing family that was just beginning to stretch its legs. Its world was full of danger. Big cats prowled the grasslands. Giant reptiles, hyenas, and crocodiles ruled the rivers and watering holes. Food could be hard to find. The seasons were unpredictable. Drought could come quickly, and shelter was never guaranteed. To survive here, on the border of forest and savanna, meant being flexible. It meant learning to move between two worlds. And Sahelanthropus may have done just that. Its body was likely still suited for climbing. Curved fingers, strong arms, a torso built for balance. But its head told another story. One of transition. Of a species caught between two ways of life. And sometimes, that's exactly where evolution thrives. The patchwork terrain of Central Africa forced early primates to change. In places where trees were thick, those who climbed better survived. In areas where the trees grew sparse, those who walked more easily had the edge. This constant mix, this shifting balance, shaped our lineage. It's easy to think of evolution as a ladder climbing steadily upward. But the truth is far more complex. It's a landscape of forks and fading paths, of dead ends and hidden alleys. For every species that led to us, there were many more that did not. And yet, each one played a role in shaping the world that allowed humans to appear. Sahelanthropus didn't know it was starting anything. It was just trying to live, to find food, to avoid predators, to raise young. But in doing that, it started something vast. Over the next few million years, other hominins would appear, more specialized, more upright, more brainy. They would leave better fossils, clearer tools, more evidence. But it all began here, with a partial skull in the desert and a creature who could walk on two legs. Around 6 million years ago, this branch of upright primates would continue to evolve. A species called Origins lived in what is now Kenya. Then came Australopithecus, another early biped that may have split time between trees and ground. These species help fill the gaps, painting a picture of a lineage slowly adapting to a new way of life. By around 4 million years ago, bipedalism was no longer experimental. It was established, and the terrain was changing with it. Volcanoes rumbled in the Rift Valley. Lakes expanded and shrank. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. Each environmental pressure shaped the bodies of those who lived through it. And now, in the highlands of East Africa, a new hominin was beginning to thrive. It had stronger legs, a pelvis designed for walking, teeth suited for a diverse diet. It still had a small brain, but its behavior was changing. It lived in groups. It raised its young with care. And it left behind something extraordinary: footprints, frozen in volcanic ash. We call it Australopithecus afarensis. But before Lucy ever walked across the plains of Hadar, there was Sahelanthropus, the quiet beginning of a story that was just getting started. The ground had shifted. The sky was still the same. But somewhere in that ancient heat, something new had begun. A spark, faint and slow, but impossible to reverse. It would take millions of years, dozens of species, and countless changes. But the long road to humanity had opened, and someone had started walking. The wind carries dust across the valley floor. The sun sits low in the sky, casting long shadows across ridges of ancient rock and dry savanna grass. In the distance, a small figure moves, not quite ape, not yet human, upright, deliberate, and silent beneath the open African sky. It is around 3.5 million years ago, in what is now Ethiopia. Here, in the heart of the East African Rift Valley, the Earth itself is splitting apart. This vast crack in the planet's surface stretches for thousands of kilometers, reshaping the land through volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and shifting tectonic plates. It is a place of violence and beauty, a place where the ground opens and the air smells of minerals, ash, and heat. And in this unstable landscape, evolution is doing something extraordinary. Among the animals that move through the valleys, the antelope, the crocodiles, the large flightless birds, there walks a new kind of hominin. It is called Australopithecus afarensis. It has a face shaped by both past and future, a protruding jaw, large cheekbones, and a forehead that slopes backward. Its arms are long and strong, made for climbing. But its legs are different. Its pelvis is short and broad. Its feet point forward. It does not shuffle like a chimpanzee. It walks. Not in the way we walk, not yet. But it walks on 2 feet, step by step, across open ground. Its body is about the size of a modern child. Females stand around 3.5 feet tall, while males grow closer to 5 feet. They weigh less than 100 pounds. Their brains are still small, roughly a third the size of ours, but their minds are alert. Their senses are sharp. Their world is full of danger, but also opportunity. And in this place, walking upright is not just a trait. It's a survival tool. To understand what this means, we need to look at one of the most important fossils ever discovered, a partial skeleton found in 1974 in the Hadar region of Ethiopia. She was named Lucy by the team who uncovered her after the Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which played in camp the night she was found. Lucy was small. Her bones were delicate, her skull incomplete. But her pelvis and leg bones told a clear story. She had walked on 2 legs, full time, not occasionally, not awkwardly, but with confidence and efficiency. That alone would be remarkable. But what makes Lucy even more important is what she tells us about the body plan of our ancient relatives. Her knee joints, the angle of her thigh bones, the structure of her feet. All of them point to a creature that was built for walking. And yet, she still had features that linked her to the trees. Her arms were long, and her fingers were curved. The kind of anatomy you'd expect from a species that still climbed for food or safety. Lucy's people lived in both worlds. Upright walkers on the ground, agile climbers in the canopy. They were flexible. And flexibility is power. But fossils can only tell us so much. Bones are silent. They don't move. They don't leave tracks. Except, sometimes they do. Over 1,000 kilometers south of where Lucy was found, In northern Tanzania, a different kind of discovery offers us something even more intimate, a snapshot of movement frozen in time. At a site called Letoli, researchers uncovered a series of footprints preserved in volcanic ash, hardened over millions of years into stone. There were 3 sets of prints, moving side by side. A larger individual, a smaller one, and possibly a juvenile walking close behind. The prints are perfectly spaced. The heel strikes first, the toes push off. There is no knuckle walking here, no dragging of limbs, just clean, human-like steps across a soft surface. These footprints are over 3.6 million years old, and they belong to Australopithecus afarensis. In that moment, preserved by ash and time, we see something no fossil can ever truly show. Behavior, a decision to move forward, a group walking together, perhaps a parent and child, perhaps a small family crossing a dangerous plain between forest patches. We will never know who they were or what they were thinking, but we can follow their steps one by one and imagine the world they moved through. This world was not a paradise. The East African Rift Valley was volatile. Volcanoes erupted with little warning. Rivers flooded and disappeared. Grasslands caught fire during long dry seasons. Crocodiles waited at the water's edge. Large cats stalked the tall grass. And above all, the sky was open. There was little cover, little protection. To survive here meant to move carefully, to stay alert, and to work together. We think Australopithecus afarensis lived in small social groups, probably not unlike chimpanzees today. They may have shared food, cared for young together, and watched each other's backs. There are signs of complex behavior, even if not quite culture as we define it now. They likely used basic objects, sticks to dig, leaves to scoop water, but no lasting tools. Not yet. Their diet was wide-ranging. Their teeth show wear from tough vegetation, roots, tubers, leaves, fruits. They may have scavenged meat when they could, but they weren't hunters. Their jaws were strong, adapted for chewing rough food. Their days were spent moving between patches of edible plants, avoiding predators, and tending to their young. One of the most fascinating things about Australopithecus is how long they lasted. They weren't a short-lived evolutionary experiment. They existed for nearly 2 million years, from about 4.2 to 2.0 million years ago. That's 10 times longer than Homo sapiens has existed so far, and across that long stretch of time, they remained remarkably successful. Different species of Australopithecus appeared across Africa. Some were more robust, with larger jaws and stronger bodies. Others were more gracile, lighter, and more delicate. But they all shared the key trait of upright walking. They were no longer just apes, they were hominins, and they were here to stay. But even as they thrived, the world was changing. The climate continued to shift. Africa went through cycles of wet and dry. Forests expanded and collapsed. Grasslands spread like fire. And with each shift, new pressures arrived. To survive these changes, a species had to be adaptable, not just physically, but mentally. By around 2.5 million years ago, something new was beginning. Among the descendants of Australopithecus, a few individuals were doing things differently. They were beginning to manipulate the world in a new way, with intention. Somewhere near a riverbank, perhaps in what is now Tanzania, a small group gathered around a fallen carcass. Instead of using teeth to tear into the flesh, one of them picked up a rock. Not just any rock, a sharp one, flaked by striking it against another. And with it, they began to cut. This moment marked the dawn of technology, the start of something that would define the human story from that point forward. But it could never have happened without the foundation laid by Australopithecus. Their hands were capable, Their brains were growing, their bodies had freed the upper limbs from walking duties, and their social lives encouraged imitation and learning. So when one of their descendants first struck stone against stone, and sparks of a new kind of intelligence began to glow, it was not a sudden leap. It was the next step in a very long walk. And that walk had begun millions of years earlier, in the heat and dust of the Rift Valley. Australopithecus was the bridge between the forests and the plains, between the trees and the tools, between instinct and intention. They were not yet human, but they were not far. Their fossils remind us how much can be lost and how much can be remembered. A single knee joint, a worn tooth, a curled rib, each one a clue. A footprint in stone, no larger than your hand, can tell the story of movement, of care, of survival. When you picture them, don't see them as missing links. They are not gaps in a chain. They are chapters in a book, full ones. They had lives. They had children. They lived through storms and seasons, through droughts and migrations. And all the while, they walked, across ash, across grass, across time. They didn't know where they were going, but they kept walking. And eventually, some of them began to think differently. Their hands started to shape the world. Their minds started to question it. And from them would come something new. The river cuts through the valley in long, winding loops. Its banks are lined with acacia trees, and the morning air is filled with the sound of insects, distant bird calls, and the rustle of leaves in a slow breeze. The land is calm now, but sometime around 2.4 million years ago, this quiet scene would have looked very different. Near the water's edge, a small group of early humans is gathered. Their movements are cautious. They aren't the largest animals in the area. They aren't the fastest either, but something is changing, something small, something powerful. One of them bends down to pick up a rock, not for throwing, not for cracking nuts, but for something far more deliberate. This is the moment where the human story begins to shift, not just physically, but mentally. This is the age of Homo habilis. The name means handyman, and it was chosen for a reason. For the first time in the fossil record, we see evidence of early humans making tools on purpose, not just using objects from the environment, but reshaping them, creating edges, producing function. Before Homo habilis, tools may have been used occasionally, a stick here, a sharp stone there. But with this species, tool use became a central part of life. It was no longer an option. It was part of the strategy, and the tools they made, though simple, were revolutionary. Imagine a rounded stone, cracked carefully against another, until a sharp flake breaks off. That flake can slice meat from bone. It can sever tendons. It can scrape hides or dig into roots. These were the first stone tools, the beginning of what we now call the older one tradition. It doesn't sound impressive, not compared to the complexity of modern life. But that flake changed everything. It opened up an entirely new menu of survival. With it, early humans could access parts of the animal that predators left behind, the tough meat, the organs, and most importantly, the marrow inside long bones. Marrow is rich in fat, dense in calories, and vital for growing brains. And brains were growing. Homo habilis had a brain roughly 30% larger than that of Australopithecus. Still smaller than ours today, but a meaningful increase. That extra brain tissue came with costs. It needed more energy, more nutrients, and stone tools helped provide them. They also helped shape behavior. Now, early humans weren't just reacting to the environment. They were changing it, even in small ways. They could return to a carcass and extract more from it. They could carry tools across the landscape. They could plan for tomorrow, to keep a flake that might be useful later, or to find a rock with better edges. Their hands changed too. Fossil evidence shows improved grip, a thumb that could press against fingers with more force, and a wrist that allowed for better control. These changes weren't just physical, they were functional. The hand and the brain evolved together, each pushing the other forward. We know about Homo habilis because of what was found in Olduvai Gorge in northern Tanzania. This place is one of the most important sites in the study of human evolution. Layers of sediment exposed by erosion have revealed a long history of ancient life, and in those layers, fossils of Homo habilis were found alongside stone tools and butchered bones. That connection is everything. It tells us that this species was not just using tools, it was building a way of life around them. The individuals themselves were still quite small. Homo habilis stood between 3 and 4.5 feet tall, with long arms and a relatively flat face. They looked more human than Australopithecus, but they weren't fully modern yet. Their bodies still hinted at a climbing past, strong upper limbs, curved fingers, but their future was on the ground. And life on the ground wasn't easy. Large predators roamed the savannas. Lions, leopards, saber-toothed cats, crocodiles in the rivers, hyenas on the plains. Early humans couldn't outrun them. They couldn't fight them head-on, but they could work together. They could watch, wait, and scavenge. They could think ahead. It's possible that Homo habilis wasn't a hunter at all. More likely, they were opportunistic scavengers, following carnivores at a safe distance, waiting until the predators had eaten their fill, and then moving in to collect what was left. With stone tools, even scraps could become meals. Bones could be cracked. Sinew could be sliced. This strategy made use of timing. It required caution, patience, and probably some communication. Nothing like modern language, but perhaps simple calls, gestures, or shared attention. They may have pointed, they may have signaled danger. These behaviors would set the stage for deeper cooperation later on. And cooperation was key. Living in groups allowed them to share food, protect each other's young, and pass down knowledge. A good tool once made could be copied by another. A new technique could spread across a family. Learning was no longer just instinctual. It was cultural, even if in the most basic form. And slowly, those cultural sparks began to catch. We don't have evidence of fire yet, not at this stage. But we do see signs of preference. Some rocks were selected more than others. Some places became gathering spots. The beginnings of tradition, not in the way we think of it today, but in behavior repeated across generations. There's something deeply human about this. The act of returning to a good stone source. The moment of choosing which flake to keep. The habit of coming back to the same waterhole, the same shelter, the same path. All of these behaviors suggest memory, familiarity, and the slow building of a mental map. By 2 million years ago, Homo habilis was still present in eastern and southern Africa. But something else was stirring. A new species was beginning to appear. One taller, leaner, and more efficient at walking long distances. A species with a larger brain, more advanced tools, and eventually, fire. But even as that new form emerged, Homo habilis held on. Their place in the story is sometimes overshadowed by those who came after. But without them, the steps that followed wouldn't have been possible. They were the first to look at the world and shape it, even in small ways. The first to break the boundary between environment and intention. And that matters. Because everything that followed, the hand axe, the fire pit, the shelter, the spear, the wheel, the city, began with a simple flake of stone struck from a river rock by a pair of careful hands. Hands that belonged to Homo habilis. They lived in a world full of sharp edges and hard lessons. A world where every day meant risk, from predators, from injury, from starvation. But in that world, they carved out a way forward, literally. The Oldowan tools they left behind are still found today, in riverbeds, in dry basins, embedded in sediment layers deep beneath the earth, simple flakes, hammerstones, cores. But each one tells a story. They tell us that someone stood there millions of years ago. Someone made a choice. Someone changed their world. And those choices echoed forward into the footsteps of Homo erectus, who would leave Africa, into the minds of Homo sapiens, who would imagine and create, into the tools and buildings and satellites of today. But at the center of it all, at the quiet beginning, was a hand, a rock, and a mind that had started to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. The stone tool glints in the morning sun. The fire beside it is dying down, leaving behind a circle of ash and blackened wood. Not far away, a group of early humans gathers at the edge of a river, crouched beside the water. They wash, drink, and watch their surroundings carefully. It is 1.8 million years ago, and something is different. These people are taller. Their arms are shorter than those who came before, their legs longer. Their posture is straighter, their bodies leaner. They walk with efficiency. They run with power. They are better suited for heat, for distance, for the open. This is Homo erectus. And for the first time in human history, our ancestors are not just surviving, they are spreading. Where Homo habilis had stayed close to forests and rivers, Homo erectus moves beyond them, across savannas, into grasslands, over hills, across dry valleys. They don't just adapt to their environment, they follow it, they track it, and eventually they begin to leave Africa altogether. No other hominin before them had done this, and they wouldn't just travel a little. Over time, they would cross entire continents. We've found Homo erectus fossils in Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, but also in Georgia, near the Caucasus Mountains, and in Indonesia, on the island of Java, and in China, as far north as Zhoukoudian near modern-day Beijing. They had left their birthplace behind. Not all at once, not as a grand expedition, but slowly over generations. One valley, one ridge, one watering hole at a time. And they didn't just wander, they settled, they endured. At the site of Dmanisi in Georgia, scientists found skulls of Homo erectus dated to around 1.8 million years ago. One of them belonged to an elderly individual with no teeth, yet the bone had healed. That means this person lived for a long time after losing the ability to chew. Which also means something else. Someone must have helped. Someone must have brought them softer food, looked after them, kept them alive. This is one of the first signs of care in the archaeological record. And it came from Homo erectus. But what made them so successful? Part of the answer lies in their bodies. Homo erectus was built to move. Their long legs and narrow hips made them excellent walkers. Their foot structure was almost identical to ours. Their body proportions helped them travel efficiently over long distances, conserving energy under the harsh sun. And movement wasn't just physical. Their minds were changing too. They had larger brains, up to 1,000 cubic centimeters, almost double that of Homo habilis. Still smaller than a modern human's, but large enough to support more complex thinking, planning, and cooperation. With bigger brains came better tools. Unlike the simple flakes of the Oldowan tradition, Homo erectus developed a new kind of technology, one that showed precision, symmetry, and a sense of design. These were the Acheulean tools, hand axes shaped on both sides, sharp and balanced, capable of cutting, scraping, digging, and more. They weren't just functional, they were crafted. Some of these axes are so finely made, it's clear they required skill and practice, and they weren't always left behind at kill sites. Some were found in places with no evidence of butchery or food preparation. This has led some researchers to wonder, were some tools made to be shown, not just used? A sign of status, a teaching tool, or maybe even an early form of pride in craftsmanship. Whatever the reason, one thing is certain: Homo erectus wasn't just surviving, they were improving. And then there's fire. No earlier hominin had controlled it. Some may have gathered near natural flames after a lightning strike, or used the warmth of smouldering logs. But Homo erectus is widely believed to be the first to control fire, to tend it, protect it, and use it intentionally. Fire changed everything. It allowed them to cook food, making it easier to digest and safer to eat. It provided warmth on cold nights, light after the sun had set, a gathering point for groups, a tool for protection, a way to stay safe from predators in the dark. The glow of fire extended the human day, and it may have changed how we communicated. Sitting around a fire, without the need to constantly move or forage, gave people the chance to interact, to share, to mimic, to teach. These were the early sparks of culture. Not yet language as we know it, but a space where sound and gesture could begin to carry more meaning. And then there's what fire meant socially. Fires became places to return to, markers of territory, anchors for group memory. And in a world without homes or permanent shelters, that meant a lot. Over hundreds of thousands of years, Homo erectus continued to spread. By around 1.5 million years ago, they had established themselves across much of Africa and parts of Western Asia. By 1 million years ago, they were thriving in Southeast Asia. And in some parts of Indonesia, they may have survived until just 100,000 years ago, meaning they lived for nearly 2 million years. That's 10 times longer than modern humans have existed. They lived through ice ages, through droughts, through the rise and fall of other species. They were resilient, adaptable, and remarkably durable. In Zhoukoudian, near Beijing, a large cave system was home to what scientists called Peking Man, a population of Homo erectus who lived there around 700,000 years ago. The cave held stone tools, evidence of fire use, and thousands of animal bones, including deer, horses, and even bears. They hunted, or scavenged, or both. They had figured out how to survive in colder climates, how to share space, and how to persist. The fact that they did all of this without modern language, without agriculture, without metal, is a reminder of just how powerful simple tools and flexible minds can be. But what's even more remarkable is how long they lasted. While other hominin species came and went, rising, evolving, and vanishing, Homo erectus remained. For nearly 2 million years, they were the most widespread and successful human species on Earth. And yet, they were not the final version. Back in Africa, something else was happening. Even as Homo erectus spread across the continents, evolution continued its work. New experiments were unfolding. In small, scattered populations, subtle changes were beginning to accumulate. Brains were growing, behavior was shifting, social bonds were deepening. And somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, something new would appear. A species with a rounder skull, a higher forehead, a chin, a mind that could imagine things that didn't exist yet, a voice that could carry meaning across time. But that was still in the future. For now, the fire still crackles in the night. The stone tools lie near the embers. The group sleeps in a circle, facing outward, listening for movement in the dark. They will wake at dawn, follow the river, and walk toward new ground. They do not know it, but they are paving the way for everything to come. The fire burns low. The stone tools lie still. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus has carried the torch of humanity, walking upright, mastering tools, learning to travel, and wielding fire against the night. But the world is shifting again. Climates change, forests shrink and grow back again. Rivers dry up and return. The earth pulses with cycles of heat and cold, and those who survive must adapt to every turn. And somewhere in Africa, deep in the varied terrain of rocky hills, dry savannas, and shaded river valleys, something new begins to stir. A different kind of hominin begins to appear, similar to Homo erectus, but subtly different. The brow ridge softens, the skull shape rounds, the face pulls inward. The hands grow more delicate, but more precise. And inside the brain, something even more dramatic is unfolding. Around 300,000 years ago, the first anatomically modern humans begin to emerge. This is us, Homo sapiens. And yet, if we stood face to face with one of them, a person from 300,000 years ago, we might not realize it right away. They would look human, yes. Their posture, their face, their hands, all unmistakably familiar. But their eyes would carry a different kind of quiet. A mind still forming something we now take for granted. Imagination. The oldest known fossils of our species were found in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco. When they were first discovered, scientists thought they belonged to a more primitive species. But as technology improved and dating techniques became more accurate, a stunning realization emerged. These bones were around 300,000 years old, and yet they belonged to people who looked like us. The skulls were slightly elongated, the faces were flat and modern, the teeth were small, but the brain cases were still in the process of evolving into their rounded, modern shape. These were early Homo sapiens, caught in a moment of transition. The body was ready. The mind was on its way. Across Africa, other remains began to surface. In places like Omo Kibish in Ethiopia and Florisbad in South Africa. Each new discovery added pieces to the puzzle. Our species didn't emerge in a single location. It seems to have appeared in multiple regions of Africa at once, with groups sharing genes, behaviours, and knowledge over thousands of years. This idea, sometimes called African multi-regionalism, suggests that early human populations were not isolated. They moved, they mixed, they evolved together. Africa was not a backdrop, it was a network, a living, breathing system of change. And the world these early humans lived in was rich and varied. There were no cities, no farms, no written language. But there were rivers and grasslands, deserts and forests. Herds of antelope ran across the plains. Lions hunted in the tall grass. Crocodiles waited in muddy waters. The days were hot. The nights were cold. Life was hard, but possible. These early humans lived in small groups, moving with the seasons. They hunted game, gathered roots, dug for tubers, and collected berries. They used fire for warmth, for cooking, and for keeping predators away. They built simple shelters. They cared for the sick, and they buried their dead. But the biggest shift wasn't in the body, it was in the mind. We begin to see signs of symbolic thinking, the ability to represent something that isn't physically present. This is where imagination lives. This is where memory becomes story, where planning becomes culture. In a cave at Blombos, on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. Not a skull, not a tool, but a piece of ochre, red iron-rich pigment, with a geometric pattern carved into it. Cross-hatching, intentional, abstract, a symbol. It's over 70,000 years old. Nearby, they also found shells with holes drilled into them, likely worn as beads. Some even had traces of pigment, as if they'd been dyed for colour. These weren't just decorations. They were identity. They were expression. They may have meant something, a status, a memory, a connection to a place or a person. This is the moment where humans begin to create not just tools, but meaning. They begin to think in terms of before and after, in terms of us and them. They start leaving marks that outlive the hand that made them. This is no longer survival. This is culture. And it's here that we also begin to see something else. Complexity. The tools of Homo erectus were sharp, effective, and symmetrical. But the tools of Homo sapiens were diverse. Different blades for different tasks, points for spears, hooks for fishing, needles for stitching hides. And they weren't just made from stone anymore. Bone, antler, wood, ivory, anything that could be shaped was shaped. These tools tell a story of specialization, of memory, of planning ahead. They also tell a story of trade. In some archaeological sites, materials from hundreds of kilometers away have been found. Obsidian, ochre, shell, flint. This means people were not just moving, they were connecting. Knowledge was spreading. Ideas were being passed on. By around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had become the dominant hominin in Africa. Other species still existed, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in parts of Asia. But in Africa, it was our species that thrived. And yet, we didn't remain isolated. Genetic evidence shows that humans interbred with other hominins. We carry their DNA to this day. That means when modern humans finally left Africa, they didn't just replace other species. They joined with them. They merged. They shared. But that part of the story comes later. For now, in the heart of Africa, small bands of humans continue their lives. A mother teaches her child to weave fibre into cord. A hunter shapes a spear from river cane. A group gathers around a fire, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Their words are simple, but full of meaning. Their world is small, but full of life. And all the while, their minds are changing. Brain size isn't everything, but wiring matters. And by this point, the human brain had reached about 1,300 cubic centimeters, close to its modern volume. But it wasn't just size, it was shape, structure, pathways. The human brain is deeply social. It is wired for empathy, for prediction, for pattern recognition. And when combined with language, it becomes something even more powerful, a storytelling machine. It's possible that language, real grammatical language, began around this time. It's impossible to say exactly when. Words leave no fossils, but the parts of the brain that handle speech, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, were already formed. And the anatomy of the throat had shifted to allow a wider range of sounds. With language came memory, with memory came tradition, with tradition came identity, and from identity, art was born. In caves and on cliffs, humans began to paint, not randomly, but intentionally. Images of animals, bison, horses, mammoths, human figures, handprints blown with pigment, as if to say, I was here. These marks were not made yet in every region, but they were beginning to appear. The seeds of culture had been planted, and with them, the desire to move outward grew stronger. The waves roll in softly. The sky is pale and wide. On the eastern edge of Africa, a group of humans stands at the shoreline, looking out across the sea. The air is damp with salt. The tide moves in and out like breath. It's around 70,000 years ago, and something irreversible is about to begin. For hundreds of thousands of years, our species, Homo sapiens, had lived only in Africa. We had spread across forests and savannas, deserts and highlands, from Morocco to South Africa, from the Rift Valley to the Atlantic coast. But the rest of the world was still untouched by us. Until now. The Red Sea narrows to a slim channel near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. During periods of glacial activity, sea levels dropped, making this gap even smaller. Just a few dozen kilometers wide. Still a challenge, but not impossible. These early humans may have used rafts made of reeds, or they might have island hopped, crossing on foot during extremely low tides. However they did it, they succeeded. And when they stepped onto the Arabian Peninsula, they were no longer just an African species. They were global. This was the beginning of one of the most incredible journeys in the history of life on Earth, the human expansion into every continent. At first, the movement was slow. There were no maps, no roads, no plans, just groups of people following coastlines, rivers, and seasonal rains. They followed animals. They searched for shelter. They explored. But with each generation, the map grew larger. By 60,000 years ago, humans had reached South Asia, modern-day India and Sri Lanka. These lands were hot, rich in vegetation, teeming with life. The early humans here adapted quickly. They hunted deer, gathered fruit, shaped tools from local stone. They painted caves, buried their dead, and raised children under new skies. Farther east, dense rainforests opened into wide floodplains. Bamboo groves swayed in the breeze. Insects buzzed. Birds called out in thick canopies, and humans moved through it all, quietly, carefully, learning which plants to eat, which paths to follow, which sounds meant danger. And then they reached Australia. By 50,000 years ago, humans had crossed into the vast, dry continent, possibly by boat, possibly by land bridges that now lie under the sea. However it happened, it was fast. The people who arrived here were skilled travelers. They brought tools, knowledge, and fire. Australia was like nothing else. Gigantic animals, now extinct, once roamed the land. There were massive wombats, called diprotodons, towering flightless birds, giant kangaroos, and enormous lizards, longer than a car. Within just a few thousand years, many of them would vanish, likely due to a mix of climate change and human hunting. But even as ecosystems changed, humans adapted. They learned to burn the land in cycles, clearing underbrush and encouraging new growth, a practice known today as firestick farming. They painted on rock walls using ochre, charcoal, and clay. Their art told stories, stories of ancestors, of animals, of the land itself. These traditions, passed orally and visually, would continue for tens of thousands of years. And in some communities, they still survive today. Back in the West, other human groups moved northward, into the Middle East and the grassy hills of Western Asia. And there, in colder climates, they encountered others. They weren't the first people to reach these regions. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and parts of Western Asia for over 200,000 years. They were strong, stocky, and built for cold weather. Their faces were broad, their brow ridges were heavy, but their minds were sharp. And now they met us. For a time, the two species coexisted. They lived near each other, probably in overlapping territories, some competition, some cooperation, and eventually something more: interbreeding. Genetic evidence shows that almost all non-African humans today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. It means our ancestors didn't just replace Neanderthals, they joined them. The borders between species blurred. Children were born from mixed families, and those children carried the legacy forward. Neanderthals would eventually vanish around 40,000 years ago. The reasons are still debated: climate change, competition, small population size, maybe a little of everything. But their story didn't end completely. Part of them lives on, in us. Farther east, something similar happened. In the highlands of Siberia, a third group of humans lived, the Denisovans. They left almost no bones, only fragments, a tooth, a finger bone, a piece of skull. But from these scraps, whole genomes have been sequenced, and they too mingled with Homo sapiens. Today, people from parts of East Asia, Melanesia, and Australia carry Denisovan genes, a whisper of another ancient people preserved in blood and bone. And so, as humans spread, the world itself began to change. By 40,000 years ago, we had reached Western Europe. This was Ice Age Europe, cold, vast, and rugged. Massive glaciers covered the north. Reindeer, mammoths, and woolly rhinos wandered across open tundra. And here, humans found ways to survive. They made tailored clothing. They carved bones into needles. They built shelters using stone, animal hide, and wood. They also made art, some of the earliest and most astonishing ever discovered. In caves like Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, humans painted in flickering torchlight. Bulls, horses, lions, bears. They used natural pigments and followed the contours of the cave walls. These images weren't just decoration, they were expressions of memory, of belief, of identity. Some are so detailed, they still look alive. These people had language, they had stories, they had ancestors and dreams. And across the world, others were doing the same. In what is now Southeast Asia, humans carved figures from ivory. In Africa, they engraved abstract symbols into bone. In the Americas, though humans would not arrive there until later, new worlds were waiting, because the journey wasn't over. During the Ice Age, sea levels were much lower. Massive ice sheets locked away water, exposing land bridges that connected continents. One of those bridges stretched from Siberia into Alaska. It's known today as Beringia. And sometime around 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, humans crossed it. The people who made that journey, likely following herds of mammoth and bison, were entering a new, untouched land. They moved into Alaska, then down through the Americas. Coastal routes may have helped. River valleys may have guided them. Over time, they spread. By 13,000 years ago, humans were living as far south as modern-day Chile. The Americas were home to a wide range of ecosystems: deserts, rainforests, mountains, and plains. Giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and towering herbivores still roamed. But like in Australia, many of these large animals would vanish soon after humans arrived. The causes are debated. Climate shifts played a role, but human hunting likely did too. Wherever we went, we changed the world around us, not out of cruelty, not out of greed, but because that's what humans do. We build, we adapt, we transform. And so, by 10,000 years ago, the journey was complete. From the tip of Africa to the frozen edges of Siberia, from the rainforests of Southeast Asia to the high deserts of the Andes, humans had touched nearly every part of the earth. And yet, no matter where we lived, whether on islands, mountains, coasts, or plains, we remained one species. Genetically, we are more similar to each other than almost any other mammal spread across a global range. The physical differences we see, skin tone, eye shape, hair type, are shallow adaptations to different climates, to sun exposure, to altitude. They are variations within a single story, a story that began in Africa, a story of movement, of curiosity, of survival. And everywhere we went, we brought ideas with us. We brought fire, we brought tools, we brought memory, and we brought change. Because once humans reached every part of the world, they didn't stop. The earth was still quiet. The winds moved softly through tall grass. Streams traced familiar paths across the land, carving shallow valleys over centuries. Birds called out as they always had. But something had changed. It wasn't the land. It was us. The journey across the world had given humans more than just distance. It had given time. Time to observe. Time to remember. Time to notice things the rest of the animal world ignored, like the rhythm of seeds, the cycle of rains, the return of fruit to the same branch every year. And somewhere, in river valleys and sun-drenched hillsides, someone looked down at a plant and thought, what if I put this here? On purpose. It's hard to point to a single moment. No one planted the first seed with a clear idea of farming. Agriculture wasn't a sudden invention. It was a slow, quiet revolution. It began around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, in different places, at different times, in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in the valleys of China, in the highlands of New Guinea, in the forests of West Africa, in the Andes and lowlands of Mesoamerica. Each region found its own crops, its own animals, its own reasons to stay in one place. But no matter where it happened, the impact was the same. The world would never be the same again. In the Near East, people began to gather around rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The soil was rich, the seasons were predictable. Wild wheat and barley grew in abundance. People had gathered them for thousands of years, but now they were doing something new. They were harvesting the plants, saving the seeds, and returning to the same spots again and again. Over generations, the plants began to change. Without knowing the term for it, humans were practicing selection, choosing the wheat that didn't shatter easily when touched, the barley that held together just a little longer, the seeds that were easier to grind. And slowly, through quiet repetition, wild plants became domesticated crops. Wheat that once dropped its seeds at the slightest breeze now waited to be harvested. Barley that once scattered across the soil now clung tightly to the stalk. Humans had bent nature in their favor. The same happened with animals. At first, we hunted them. Goats, sheep, cattle, wild pigs. But over time, something shifted. We didn't just kill the fast ones. We killed the aggressive ones. We captured the calm, the cooperative, the young, and we kept them, not as pets, but as part of the system. Animals that once roamed freely began to live beside humans. We protected them from predators. We gave them shelter, and in return, they gave us milk, meat, hides, and manure. They pulled plows. They carried loads. They became part of the story of human survival. And with food now growing near our homes, instead of requiring a journey every day, something else became possible: staying put. Villages began to form. Small at first, just a few huts, a circle of families, a clearing near a river. But these places grew. People built walls from mud and stone. They dug pits to store grain. They shaped clay into jars. They planted trees. They fenced in animals. Some of the earliest known villages were places like Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, and Çatalhöyük, in modern-day Turkey. At Çatalhöyük, houses were packed closely together, walls touching, rooftops used as walkways. There were no streets, just ladders leading from one home to the next. Inside the homes, people painted the walls with scenes of bulls, humans, and hands. They buried their dead beneath the floors. It wasn't just shelter, it was memory. People weren't just living in a place. They were attaching themselves to its soil, to its stories, to its seasons. This new way of life, based on farming, herding, and permanent settlements, brought both opportunity and danger. On one hand, food surpluses meant more security. People didn't have to chase every meal. They could plan, they could store, they could survive droughts. And with fewer people constantly moving, more children could be raised. Populations grew, but so did the problems. Living close together meant disease could spread more easily. Waste built up. Water had to be managed. Fences were needed. So were rules. Farming required constant labor, tilling, planting, weeding, harvesting. Animals needed feeding, milking, protection. The simplicity of foraging, walking into the wild and gathering what was already there, had been traded for something new: control. And with control came structure. Not everyone had to hunt anymore. Some people could specialize. One person made pots, another carved tools. Someone else traded with nearby villages. Some began to lead, others began to follow. Hierarchies formed. Inequality began to take root. Food was no longer shared evenly. Land had value. Walls had meaning. Power had begun to settle in places, in hands, in names. But even with these shifts, farming was not an instant success. In many places, people kept both lifestyles, foraging when they could, farming when they had to. Hunting remained important. Wild plants were still gathered. It took thousands of years for agriculture to truly dominate human life. But once it did, there was no turning back. And everywhere it took root, it changed not only the land, but the people. In China, rice and millet became staple crops. Rice paddies reshaped entire landscapes, carving terraces into hillsides and creating a rhythm of water, sun, and seed. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash became the three sisters, grown together in a symbiotic trio. In Africa, yams, sorghum, and oil palm formed the basis of early diets. Each plant brought with it not just calories, but identity. What you farmed shaped how you lived. What you stored shaped how you planned. And soon, the foods people grew became tied to rituals, to beliefs, to origin stories. A seed planted wasn't just a source of food, it was a promise, a future, and the rhythms of life began to follow that seed. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant harvest, winter meant waiting. The year was now a cycle. Time became predictable, time could be counted, and from that counting came something else: the beginnings of calendars, of planning, of written records. Because as food storage increased, so did the need to manage it. How much grain was saved? How much was traded? Who owned what? Who was owed what? And once people began to keep track of food, they began to keep track of everything. But before writing, before civilization, before kings and temples, there was the field, the herd, the hut beside the stream. There was the first seed pressed into damp soil. There was a child watching their parents scatter grain across a plot of earth. There was the realization that something buried could come back again. Different, bigger, more. The agricultural revolution was not just about crops. It was about perception. The idea that the world could be managed, that nature could be shaped, that effort could lead to abundance. And it spread, not always quickly, not always easily, but steadily. Some people resisted it. Some places never fully adopted it. Even today, some cultures continue to forage and hunt as part of their identity. But for most of the world, farming became the foundation of life. It fed cities, it built economies, it shaped landscapes, it made everything that followed possible. Because once people stayed in one place long enough, once they depended on the land, once they built systems to track their food, once they worked together in large numbers, something new began to form. The seeds of civilization. The fields are quiet before sunrise. The stars are still visible above the river valley. But in the distance, faint smoke curls upward from a small cluster of homes. Fires are being rekindled, pots stirred. A farmer opens a gate and lets his sheep into the morning light. A boy carries water from a nearby well. Somewhere across the reeds, a bell rings. It's about 5,000 years ago, and the human world is changing again. This time, in ways that will echo forever. The quiet villages of the agricultural age are becoming something new, bigger, busier, more connected. Instead of scattered huts and small farms, people are now gathering in places with names, with temples, with leaders. These places have walls, they have roads, they have systems, they are cities. Civilization has arrived, but it didn't come all at once, and it didn't begin in just one place. Like farming, civilization was a global shift, rising independently in multiple regions, where humans had already been farming for thousands of years. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humans began to build cities out of mud brick. They shaped canals and irrigation ditches that cut across the land, feeding fields of barley and wheat. They raised temples above the rooftops, their stair-step structures stretching toward the sky. These were the ziggurats, part house of worship, part seat of power. Cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Ur were some of the first to appear, forming around 3,500 BCE. Uruk, in particular, grew fast. By some estimates, it reached a population of over 50,000, a staggering number for the time. Streets buzzed with markets, carts, and livestock. Craftspeople shaped tools, wove cloth, and baked clay bricks in the sun. Priests recorded offerings. Officials oversaw storage rooms and counted grain. But how did they remember it all? This is when something truly revolutionary emerged. Something not made of stone or fire or wood. Something made of symbols, writing. At first it was simple, just marks on clay tablets, tokens for cattle, signs for grain, numbers scratched beside baskets. But over time, these symbols became more refined, more flexible. They began to capture names, transactions, orders, prayers, laws. This early writing system is known as cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, named for the way scribes pressed reeds into soft clay to leave triangular impressions. Cuneiform is one of the earliest scripts in human history, and with writing came memory, not just the memory of individuals, but the memory of civilization itself. For the first time, humans could speak across time. A ruler's order could outlive his voice. A merchant's contract could be enforced long after the handshake. A story could be told by someone who wasn't there. Human knowledge was no longer tied to the human body. Around the same time, in a different part of the world, another river valley was awakening. Along the Nile in northeastern Africa, a long ribbon of green cut through the desert. The river flooded regularly, depositing dark, rich soil onto its banks. It became the backbone of one of the most enduring civilizations in history, ancient Egypt. By 3100 BCE, Egypt was unified under a single ruler, the first pharaoh. The people of the Nile developed their own form of writing, known as hieroglyphs, beautiful stylized symbols carved into stone and painted onto tomb walls. They built monumental architecture, temples, pyramids, statues, using labor, planning, and the coordination of thousands. But Egypt was more than its kings. It was a web of villages, priests, scribes, farmers, and artists. People who understood the rhythms of the river and timed their harvests to the seasons. People who embalmed their dead and wrapped them in linen. People who told stories of gods, of journeys to the afterlife, of sun and shadow. And across the world, other civilizations were rising too. In the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, Cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were laid out in orderly grids. They had advanced drainage systems, public baths, and wide streets. Their bricks were standardized, their weights and measures consistent. And yet, much about the Indus people remains a mystery. Their script is still undeciphered. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what they called themselves. But their cities speak volumes of planning, cooperation, and quiet sophistication. To the east, in China, early civilizations began to form along the Yellow River. Here, people farmed millet and raised pigs. Dynasties like the Shang emerged, using bronze to craft tools and weapons. They cast ceremonial vessels with ornate designs and carved messages onto bones and turtle shells, the earliest form of Chinese writing. Meanwhile, in the Americas, civilizations were also beginning to take shape. In Peru, along the Pacific coast, the Norte Chico culture built ceremonial centers and stone pyramids as early as 3000 BCE, nearly as old as the pyramids of Egypt. In Mesoamerica, the ancestors of the Olmec began planting maize, domesticating cacao, and laying the foundations for the cities that would come centuries later. All across the world, humans were organizing into something larger than the tribe. They were building systems of government, some ruled by kings, others by councils, others by priests. They were organizing labor to build temples, dig canals, harvest crops, and defend city walls. They were assigning roles: scribes, bakers, smiths, soldiers. And they were storing knowledge in clay, stone, and memory. But civilization came with a cost. In the foraging days, wealth was what you could carry. Inequality was limited. But now land could be owned, food could be stored, power could be centralized. And with that came hierarchy, class divisions, slavery, conflict. Walls were built, not just to keep out invaders, but to protect the wealth inside. And yet, for all its flaws, civilization also allowed for incredible growth. The earliest codes of law were written, like the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon, around 1750 BCE. It spelled out justice in stone, how to resolve disputes, punish crimes, and settle debts. It wasn't always fair, especially between classes, but it was a system, a society trying to organize itself with rules instead of chaos. And then there was knowledge. Civilizations tracked the stars, they built calendars, they mapped the skies and predicted eclipses. They studied herbs and illness, birth and death. They wrote poems, songs, histories, and myths. They asked questions about gods, about life, about what comes after. They carved their names into stone, hoping someone would remember them, and we did. Even today, we walk through the ruins they left behind. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temples of Thebes, the citadels of the Indus, the oracle bones of early China. These were not just buildings, they were ideas made solid. They were memory, turned into matter. And they marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Because from here, history accelerates. New empires rise, armies march, new religions are born, philosophies spread, trade routes connect continents, language changes, borders shift, cities fall, new ones take their place. But it all began with fire, with stone, with walking upright under the African sun. It began with Sahelanthropus, 6 to 7 million years ago, scanning the savannah for food. It passed through Australopithecus, walking the Rift Valley on 2 legs. Through Homo habilis, cracking bones beside a river. Through Homo erectus, spreading across continents with tools and fire. Through early Homo sapiens, painting in caves, stringing shells, imagining futures. Through foragers planting seeds, and through farmers settling by rivers. It all led here, to cities, to writing, to the moment when memory became permanent, to the first empires. We are still living in the shadow of those first great cities. Their inventions shape our lives every day. Writing, laws, roads, agriculture, architecture, calendars, currency. They're all echoes of that early world. And yet, in some ways, we are not so different. We still gather in groups. We still share stories. We still look up at the stars and wonder where we came from. And the answer, as strange and beautiful as it is, reaches back millions of years to a time before words, before walls, before kings. A time when the only thing separating us from the rest of the animal world was the way we walked, and where that walk eventually led.